Hi folks, and welcome back to the Advantage Applications channel. My name's Rich, and this is my first video in the series on creating Microsoft Access solutions using SharePoint as a backend for data storage. And in this series, we're going to cover several topics, like why SharePoint is a good choice for a backend for data storage to begin with, how to design tables in Access that are ultimately going to become SharePoint lists, how to create relationships between SharePoint lists in Access using queries and other form controls, special caveats when you're using custom forms and form controls that interact with and are bound to SharePoint list data, how to distribute a solution like this to your users, including versioning control. And finally, we're going to look at how to extend your Access solutions that are built like this using Power Apps and Power BI. Now, to demonstrate all this, we're going to be building a very simple application that would mimic an event reporting tool. And if you watch till the end of the video, I'll show you a version of this application that I have in use at several of the companies that I support, just to give you an idea about what you can do with Access when it's paired with SharePoint. And as always, all of the files that I use and all of the source code in these videos are available to my channel members. If you would like to become a member of the channel for less than a price of a cup of coffee, there will be a link in the description on how to do that. So let's go ahead and jump right in and see how to design tables that we know we're going to move up to SharePoint, and then how to ultimately migrate those tables out of Access into SharePoint. The overall design purpose for the application we're building in this series is to allow users to record details about observed events so that other users can query summarized data or view reports about those events. So, for example, a user might observe a damaged piece of equipment in the warehouse. Our application will provide a form where the user can record the date and time they discovered the damaged equipment, where they discovered the damaged equipment, what type of event they're submitting, the observer's name or user ID, and any comments they want to make about the event they are submitting. Then this information will be stored for reporting and trend identification later. And these are the design models for the tables that we're going to use to accomplish this. We may add more tables as we go, we may modify these tables as we go, but this is how we're going to start. So we're going to have TBL event details, and it's going to have 4 fields. These are the data types that we're going to use, any formatting that we're going to use, and default values. The first field is going to be an auto number field. It's going to be called Event Details ID. We're going to capture the date and time of the event. It's going to be date type. We're going to format it as a short date, and its default value is going to be the current date. We're going to have a reported by field, and this is going to be automatically captured, and it's going to be whoever is currently logged into the workstation. It's going to be a short text field. There's no particular formatting we need to apply here, and no particular default value. We're also going to capture the event location. This is not going to be text, this is going to be a number, and it's going to link back to TBL location. So the ID that is the primary key in this table is going to be the foreign key in this table. The type is going to be number, and the format is going to be long integer, and default value is going to be 0. The next table is going to be TBL event type. It's only going to have 2 fields. Its primary key field, which is an auto number named event type ID, and then the event text, which is a short text field. And this is going to basically define what types of events users can submit. Maybe it's a personnel, safety, and health event. Maybe it's a security event. Maybe it is a production quality event. Any type of event that we want people to be able to submit, we would put that information in this table. Then we have TBL location, and that is going to define what locations events can be submitted in. This is going to drive a combo box just like table event type, and users will be able to select the location that an event occurred. So this could be like the warehouse, offices, production floor, things like that. Then we have this table that's kind of special. It's called TBL trigger event type. This table is just going to pair up the event details table with the event type table. And that's going to make a lot more sense as we go forward, but basically as a user submits an event, that event ID will go into this table, and for each event type that's selected for that event, there will be multiple records in here, each containing the event ID and any event type IDs associated with it. But let's go ahead and design our tables now in Access. And this is the way I usually do it. I'll design my tables in Access because I really like the controls for designing tables in Access versus SharePoint. And then once my tables are designed, my queries are set up, my user interface is set up, I test everything, and then I move the tables out to SharePoint as lists and then relink. Okay, we go up to our Create menu here, and I'm going to select Table Design. The first field we're going to add is Event Details ID, It's going to be an auto number field, and it's also going to be this table's primary key. The next field is date time of event. This is of course going to be a date field. We're going to format it as short date, as we talked about earlier. And its default value is going to be the current date. So I'll use the date function for that. Then we're going to add the reported by field. This is just going to be short text, and we don't need a particular default value for this or a particular formatting. Then finally, we're going to have event location, and again, this is going to be a foreign key. So rather than short text, it is going to be a number field. It already defaults to long integer, which is what we want, and it defaults to a value of 0, which also is what we want. So now we can save this table and name it TBL event details and click OK, and it pops up over here in our navigator. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and create the rest of the tables that we had outlined in our document here. Okay, now that we have our tables defined and designed, the next step typically would be to come into Database Tools here and define some relationships. However, if we create relationships in Access before we migrate these tables out to SharePoint, it's going to be useless because that will not migrate out to SharePoint. SharePoint does not recognize the relationships that we set up in Access. Once we move these tables out to SharePoint and relinked to them, then we can redefine those relationships in the Access front end. Another thing that's just good practice typically, but actually necessary when we're going to create tables that are going to ultimately reside on SharePoint, is to be sure to always define a clear-cut primary key for each of your tables. I like to make sure that it is the first field in my tables, and I like to name it explicitly for the table that it's in. Part of the reason I do that is because when you migrate these tables up to SharePoint, it's going to add a bunch of fields to this table to begin with. And sometimes it names an ID field or similarly named field, and it can create some confusion if you don't go ahead and explicitly name an ID field for your table. The other thing that people typically do when they're developing a database in Access, especially if they intend to work with the data or view the data directly in the tables, is they will make some of their fields a lookup field. So like in TBL event details here, event location is only going to store the ID of a location that's defined in TBL location. So if I were to look at this data directly in the table, all I would see in that field would be a number, and it isn't very meaningful. If I could actually see the text of the location that was chosen, that would be better if I was looking at the data directly in the table. So what people will do is they'll come into the design view of that table, and for that field, they'll create a lookup by defining either a list box or a combo box, and then making the row source of that control the table that they're storing the ID from. So in this case, I could do something like this and save that as the row source, bind to the first column, which is the ID. It now has two columns, and I would display the second column. If you aren't familiar with the way I just set that combo box up, let me know in the comments. I'm still trying to get a feel for where my viewers are in experience levels, and so far my videos have been kind of advanced. But if you'd like me to take a step back and maybe take a deeper dive into some of these more fundamental topics, I'm happy to do so. But the main takeaway, the main thing to remember, is that as we define locations in this table, let's say offices is going to be one of our locations, warehouse, loading docks, production floor. We could now, in this table, if we select event location, it now becomes a combo box because that's what we said we want to see, and its row source has the text of the items available from TBL location. And if I select one of those, that's what is displayed. It's not what's stored. The actual value stored in the field is the numeric ID value for production, but it's displayed to the user as text. But when you are going to migrate tables up to SharePoint, you don't want those types of lookup fields to exist in your table. And in this application, we're going to provide user interfaces through forms that the users are going to create and modify data with. So they definitely won't be looking at the data directly in the tables. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that lookup field. and save my changes. We'll go ahead and leave the values that we created in table location, and we may add more as we go. But since this is going to drive a combo box, we want our data already in there. And we will also add our combo box choices to event type. And that's enough to start with right there, I think. So now we're ready to copy these tables up to SharePoint lists. But before we do, I want to show you something that's also important to note. You see in this table here that the entries I've made are in numeric order 1, 2, 3, and 4. If I was to delete production floor, and right now it's identity 4, and add something else in there, I'm going to add production floor right back in. You see now that it's 1, 2, 3, and 5. It never repeats the identity value that it was originally assigned, which is the way it's supposed to behave. But it is important to note that when we copy this table up to SharePoint, these identities are going to reorder 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that can be a huge problem if you're migrating a database up that's already been in use. So this video, this series, is going to be completely about creating a brand new solution, one that hasn't already been in production use. Because there are definitely special considerations and special steps you have to take if you migrate up an existing solution. And I am going to cover that. In fact, I've even got a tool I've developed to help me do that at my regular work because I've had to do it several times. And if you follow those procedures, or if you use that tool, it will preserve your existing identities the way they are. But that's for another video and another time. Let's go ahead and get these tables copied up to SharePoint. Now this video assumes that you already have access to a SharePoint site. I may do a video in the future if there's interest in how to actually set up your own SharePoint site. And if you want to practice how to do this, you can actually get SharePoint for, I think, $5 a month through Microsoft per user. But this video is going to be from the perspective of an Access developer, not a SharePoint administrator. But to copy these tables up to SharePoint, it's very simple. You simply right-click the table you want to export, hover over Export in the context menu, then go down and select SharePoint List. You'll enter the address of the SharePoint site you want to upload the table to. You'll enter the name that you want to give the table once it's up on SharePoint. Since we're already happy with the names that our tables have, we're just going to keep the default. And we don't have to open the list when it's finished uploading, but I'm going to go ahead and leave that checked for right now and click OK. It copies up the table, and then it's going to open it here. Now it's a SharePoint list. Come back to Access and say OK, and I just repeat that for each of the tables that I want to export up to SharePoint. Now that all of our tables are up on SharePoint, we can delete these local tables. I just select them all, hit the delete key, confirm, and now I can go to External Data, choose New Data Source, and I'm going to use from Online Service, and here we see the SharePoint list is right on top. I just click that. Again, make sure that you've entered the web address of the SharePoint site that you want to use. We want to make sure that link to the data source is selected and not import. We don't want to import these back to local tables. We want to link to the online SharePoint tables. I say next. And now I see a list of all of the SharePoint lists that I can link to. I'm going to choose the ones that we uploaded. Table event details, table event type, table location, and table trigger event type. I click OK. It thinks for a moment, and then there they are. And if I look, I see that my data is intact. Those are the event types that I defined, and the locations. Notice here that production floor no longer has the ID of 5, but it did get the ID of 4 again, so it did reorder these 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now notice if we go into design view on any of these tables that we're going to see extra fields, a lot of extra fields that SharePoint has added, like title, color tag, compliance asset ID. I don't bother with these because they don't affect the way my program is going to run, and some of these are even useful, particularly the created, created by, and modified by fields. If you're ever curious about who modified, updated, or created a record, you can come into these fields and it's going to have their user ID and the date and time that the record was created or modified. And that's pretty handy. So why use SharePoint as a backend in the first place? Well, you gain a few things where access natively is weak. The first is security. Since your data is actually out on a server somewhere, it's much harder to hack or damage or get corrupted by mistake. In fact, the corruption risk that definitely exists in Access natively is reduced to virtually zero. So that's a big gain right off the bat. Also, you can control permissions from Access much easier than you can Access. You can simply come in here into your SharePoint site and define who you want to share it with and what level of permission you want them to have, whether it's just read or whether it's read-write or whether they can actually create new lists and things of that nature. Another big gain is accessibility. SharePoint will support many more multiple concurrent users than Access ever can, and it can be accessed over virtual private networks and other remote connections. Plus, the data you collect from your Access app is now available to anything that Microsoft has in their Power Platform. So you can now write really powerful reports against your data using Power BI. You can also implement flows to trigger certain events when data is added or changed in your lists. And in the version of this tool that I have in use with some of my clients, I've bolted on a Power app that allows them to snap pictures of whatever event that they're recording so that those photographs can go as attachments to the event when they submit it. And that ability to extend the functionality of your application is really useful at keeping your applications modern. Okay, there's one last thing I want to show you. Sometimes after you develop a table and you migrate it out to SharePoint, there may be a need to change or update the schema of that table. For instance, if we look back at our table designs here, notice in TBL event details, we don't have any field to allow a user to record a comment or a description of the event that happened. And that would actually be some really useful information, so we're going to add that now. Since our table already exists as a SharePoint list, I'm going to make that modification in SharePoint. So I come to my SharePoint site, I click this little gear icon up in the upper right corner and select Site Contents. Here I see a list of all of my lists, and we want to modify TBL event details. So I click these three dots to the right, choose Settings, and when that opens I see some options up here at the top. I'm not going to go into those right now, and a list of my fields. I'm going to come down here to Create Column. Okay, I'm just going to name my new field Description. And you want to be careful when you select field names not to choose something that's a reserved word by SharePoint. I'll use multiple lines of text since this is a description field. I won't provide a description for this field. I won't make it a required field. 6 lines for editing is sufficient. I'm going to make it plain text. And I'm going to leave Add to Default View checked. That way when I re-import this table in a moment to Access, that new field is going to show up without any problems. I click OK. And we see now that my new field, Description, has been added. Okay, I come back into Access. And to make sure I get a clean import, I'm going to delete this link. This doesn't change anything in SharePoint. It definitely doesn't delete the SharePoint list. It only deletes my link to that list from Access. So I select it. I press the delete key on my keyboard. I confirm. Okay, now I'm going to recreate a link to that list. I go to External Data, New Data Source again. Again, I choose from Online Services and SharePoint List at the top. I make sure that my SharePoint site address is correct, and I make sure that link to the data source by creating a link table is selected. I click Next. The lists are displayed once more with a check mark beside the tables that I already have links to. I'm going to reselect TBL event details and then say OK. My list is relinked as a table again, and my field shows up. Now in the next video I'm going to go over how to reestablish relationships between these tables, whether we do it through the relationships window itself or whether we just define it in queries or form controls like list boxes and control boxes. I'm going to show you now the version of this tool that I have in use at a few of the companies I support. Bear with me because I'll be recording my screen with my camera rather than using software to screen capture, so it might look a bit strange. This app is called Site Event Report Tool, and as you can see from the site selection combo box, it is used across various states, which right off the bat is something that would not be feasible in a solution built entirely in Access. Once a selection is made in this combo box, the options that appear in the department combo box filter to whatever is available for that selected site. And once the department is selected, code runs that populates the tab control below with all of the event categories and trigger items that the selected department has registered. And that's something that makes this tool very flexible. Each department can define their own custom categories and triggers via the admin controls I provide for them. Now, the way it works is that the users can simply come down in the tab control, select the tab they want, then drill down to the event trigger they want, and select that radio button. Some event triggers have child triggers that pop up in a small modal form, and departments can define this too, using the admin control forms. The originator name and user ID are automatically populated based on who is logged onto the workstation. Next, the user just provides a brief description of the event and any actions they took to resolve it. Then they click Submit. Code runs in the background that determines who should be notified about this event based on the location and type of event that's being reported. And an email is automatically generated and sent using Power Automate. And that's the first point of integration with the Power Platform that this tool uses. Users can view summarized data by defining parameters in the reporting form. I'll just grab data for the last 30 days, and then choosing to export to Excel. Code runs that creates an Excel file based on a template, exports the queried data to that file, and I can't show you the company's actual data here, so I apologize for the blurred records. But then predefined pivot tables are automatically updated, as well as pivot charts that users can modify as well. Another point of integration with the Microsoft Power Platform is in the Power BI reports that we've added onto this app. Since the data resides on SharePoint lists, this is a very easy thing to do. We have a parameters page embedded directly on the tool's SharePoint website where we can define parameters. Then we can view the data in grid view by clicking the appropriate tab at the bottom. Or we can view interactive circle graphs the same way. Also, when we view the data in grid view, we can click the hyperlink to the left of each row and it'll take us to that submitted event. The last point of integration we have with the Power Platform is this Power App that lets users snap up to 6 photos on their mobile device using either front or rear camera and submit them as attachments that will go along with the submitted event. So in this video we covered why it's a good idea to use SharePoint as a backend, some of the advantages that you gain when you do that, how to design and create your tables in Access, and then migrate those tables out to SharePoint, and finally how to link to those SharePoint lists and use them as tables in your Access database. So I hope this information is useful. I'm going to take it kind of slow and only tackle one topic like this per video in this series. And if you find this content useful, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks so much.